Welcome to the Hill Update. I'm your host, Dean Allison. There's been a lot of talk lately about inflation, the real estate market, and the economy, and just how expensive everything is getting. So, what's happening on all those fronts? Let's take on inflation first. In short, one of the reasons inflation is happening to the level higher than usual is because of the unprecedented government spending, not just in the last year, but over the last number of years. We are close to over a $350 billion deficit just from last year alone. Canada's year over year inflation rate was recently reported to be at 3.4%. Governments usually don't want to see a number this high, and usually anything under 2% is acceptable. So, what does this mean? It means that your money is now worth less. Things you buy will be more expensive. Inflation is basically a tax, which is why experts call what's happening now an inflation tax. Because goods and services are now more expensive, there may be a permanent reduction in your purchasing power. So, unless you're going to be able to get a 3.5% raise in your salary, you are going to be falling behind because everything you purchase will be at least that much more expensive to buy. That's what printing money to the extent that the federal government has done year over year over year has arguably caused. Granted, Canadians did need help, and the government did roll out programs like CERB, wage and rent subsidies, and other programs to assist those that were hardest hit. To provide this money, which the government does not have, the money needed to be printed, and so here we are. In time, we will see whether the inflation rate will stabilize back down to the 2% or just below, or if there's been a long-term damage and permanent change in the cost of everything to the economy. In the meantime, the central bank is buying $3 billion a week worth of government bonds with no timeline as to when these purchases will actually slow down or stop. Critics of this approach say that the Bank of Canada is in effect helping the federal government to pay for overspending, punishing lower income Canadians. As I mentioned, funding the government with printed money does drive up the prices of pretty much everything, boosting the cost of housing, food, and general necessities throughout the country. This leads very well into my second issue, which is real estate. I'm sure many of you have heard or seen firsthand how the real estate market during this pandemic has gone absolutely crazy. Bidding wars have become the standard in many parts of the country. Putting down a condition on a property that may mean to the seller that you're not actually serious. And so unconditional offers are what has been expected. All of these fast-paced activities in the real estate market has generated quite a bit of attention. A recent article from the CBC says that Vancouver, Toronto, and Hamilton are now the least affordable cities in North America. You heard that correctly. According to the study, the CBC cites Hamilton is less affordable than Los Angeles and New York City. That's something that many of you may find extremely surprising, but it seems to be the case. The report from Oxford Economics said that the homes in Canada are 34% more expensive than the median income household can actually afford. The report goes on to say that Canadian housing affordability has worsened considerably over the past decade, not only in Toronto and Vancouver, but also in several smaller metros. According to the Canadian Real Estate Association, national home sales set a record in March, with activity up over 76% year over year. Bloomberg News has even noticed Canada's housing market and says it's running hotter than just about anywhere else in the world. So, life is getting more expensive all around. Can Canadians afford it? Is the current way of stimulating the economy sustainable? Is Canada's central bank acting as an ATM for the Prime Minister and his emergency pandemic programs? What are other countries doing around the world? Is this a problem just here in Canada, or is this a concern around the world? What ultimately will happen if governments choose to ignore and continue to overspend? These are questions I'm going to ask my guest today, Mr. Pierre Poilievre, the current member of Parliament for Carleton, who was first elected in 2004, and he's a shadow minister for jobs and industry. He was the former shadow minister for finance. He was also a former cabinet minister for democratic reform and employment and social development. He's one of Canada's most prominent politicians and someone who has been sounding the alarm bells for years when it comes to government overspending. When we come back from break, we're going to get Pierre's thoughts on our current situation. We're going to talk about quantifying easing, and all the things that relate to government overspending. Look forward to chatting when we get back. Joining me on the show today is Pierre Poilievre, who's the Shadow Minister for Jobs and Jobs and Industry. And Pierre, thanks for joining us. You are one of the few guys that is always talking about QE or quantitative easing. I think we need to explain it, break it down for the guest here today, what exactly that means and why that is a problem here in Canada.
Well, it's a fancy way, Dean, of saying that the government is paying its bills with printed money. Here in a heartbeat is how it works. Normally, when governments run deficits, they sell bonds and treasuries to the market so that normal businesses and wealthy individuals can lend money and the government can pay its bills. But when deficits get so out of control that there's not enough money to borrow from the private sector, what they then do is have the central bank buy those bonds. So they're sold, but the government sells the bonds to the market, and the Bank of Canada buys them right back at a higher price, making a big profit for the financial institutions that get in between this deal. And that, of course, is at the expense of taxpayers. And then what happens is that floods the financial markets with cash, which of course has trickled down into massive mortgage lending, ballooning housing prices, and rising levels of inflation. So all told, it is basically a very simple concept. Pay the government's bills with printed money, and the cost is picked up by consumers in the form of inflation. That is called the inflation tax.
So, Pierre, you're one of the few people that consistently talks about money printing or QE, whatever you want to call it. Why is this so important? I mean, at the end of the day, why is nobody talking about it? Why does it not seem to be an issue? I mean, the reality is we continue to spend well beyond our means. And yet at the end of the day, I don't think people understand that there will be a day of reckoning coming down the road. Why is this something you're so passionate about?
First of all, it's a massive wealth transfer from the have-nots to the have-yachts. So inflation hurts the poorest people. I think someone once said that inflation fertilizes the rich man's soil with the poor man's sweat. So the working guy sees his wages cut in real term because he can buy less goods and services with them as the prices rise. Meanwhile, those with sumptuous real estate, financial assets, gold and silver, they get richer because the value of their assets inflates along with everything else. So simultaneously, the price of the things that the super rich own and that the poor must buy goes up. So what does that mean? It means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The second reason I'm so passionate is that it's an illegal tax. In our system of government, ever since Magna Carta, going back to 1215, we have a rule that the government, the Crown, can't tax what Parliament has not approved. In other words, you should be able to hold your MP accountable for voting in a tax increase. Well, there's been no vote. We have not voted to raise taxes. But the government, through the central bank's printing of money, is raising them anyway. So nobody is being held accountable for the fact that everyday people are paying more for government in the form of higher prices on everything they buy. So it's an illegal tax. It's a transfer from the have-nots to the have-yachts. It's unjust. It's wrong, and that's why I'm so passionate about it.
That's great. Now, we're not just the only country doing this. And so I guess my question is, we got about a minute left, and I do want to come back in the next segment and talk more about inflation in particular. Talk to us. I mean, other countries are doing this. This is a problem, not just for Canada, but for our whole world.
Well, that's why the gap between rich and poor has grown so much in places like Japan and the United States. Why do you think there was a populist backlash in the US? The wealthiest 1% saw their worth explode in value, and this resulted in populist movements on both the left and right, who were justifiably infuriated that they're doing that the working guy and gal are doing all the work, and these financial elites are making vast fortunes. floating on the top of the bubble. So, your mother told you, Dean, as my mother told me, just because everyone else is jumping off a cliff doesn't mean you have to. So just because other countries are printing money and ruining their currency does not mean we have to do the same thing.
That's great. Listen, when we come back, let's talk more specifically about inflation. You talk about being as that hidden tax. I think there's lots more to explore on that. So when we come back from break, let's talk about inflation in greater detail. Joining me on the show today is Pierre Poilievre, the MP for Carleton and the Shadow Minister for Jobs and Industry. Pierre, you've been talking about this hidden tax. I mean, inflation and what happens. Let's explain. I mean, you've got some great videos out there where you break down what exactly this means. I don't think people really appreciate what inflation does to their purchasing power. This is something that, as you said, it is really a tax that ends up at the end of the day not being voted on, not being something that is discussed, just something that makes people a lot poorer. Can you explain a little bit more about what you talk about?
Yes, well, let's put it this way. First of all, remember that the experts, the central bankers, the government told us there would be no inflation in the aftermath of COVID. They said it would be a disinflationary or a deflationary phenomenon. Well, in fact, there has been inflation from April of 2020 to April 2021, the consumer price index went up 3.4%, vastly more than the 2% that the Bank of Canada sets as its target. And so now they're saying, okay, fine, there is inflation, but it's only temporary. Well, now we're also seeing experts who are saying, well, temporary is, and it will only last about a year. Of course, when that year goes by and the prices keep rising, they say, well, maybe just another year. And then before you know it, our money will be increasingly worthless. Now, think about that. First of all, the 3.4% is an understatement of inflation, right? Because this is how they measure real estate in inflation. They measure it based on the monthly payments people must make to own a home. Well, of course, those have been moderated by artificially low interest rates, so that even though housing prices are up 30% year over year, the consumer price index says the cost of housing has only risen 3%. So in other words, nobody in their right mind thinks housing is only up 3%. So it understates the real inflation that has occurred. But even if you believe the numbers, what it means is that in April of 2021, your loonie was only worth about 96.5 cents of what it was worth a year earlier. So you lost almost 3.5 cents off the value of your coin. So imagine that. Imagine if you gave me your loonie and I gave it back to you a year later. Instead of a loonie, I gave you 3/4 and some other spare change worth 96 cents. Well, imagine you do that every year. Well, pretty soon the value of the dollar just evaporates bit by bit. And the result is that people get poorer. Now remember, money is time. Time is money. So when you clip off the edge of someone's coin through inflation, you're actually stealing a small piece of their life, a small piece of their time. Our minutes are basic fragments of our lifetime. And if we're working and our wages are being clipped off the edge of our coins through inflation, then a piece of our life is being taken away. And a piece of our freedom. So it's really deeply, it's a profound attack on our economic and personal freedom. And that's why we need to restore sound money, get the bank back to independence with a unique focus on the reducing inflation below 2%.
You know, you mentioned something that I read about all the time that, it's vastly understated. I mean, they claim it's 3.4. I've read places where it could be as high as 10 or 11 or 12% in the US and around the world. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, we look at the price of wood, new home construction, all these things. It'd be very far-fetched and hard to believe that inflation has only gone up by 3.4%. And that's the other tragedy, is that they keep changing the numbers in the basket of goods, and they've done that, for quite some time.
Yes, they do play with that. And not only that, the irony is they're claiming, it's only looks high right now because we're comparing to the first month of the original COVID lockdown when prices supposedly dropped. Well, the irony, Dean, is that prices are not just rising year over year, they're rising month over month. And in fact, the month over month numbers are worse than the annual numbers, significantly worse. So from March to April, prices are up 0.7% in 1 month. Now you say, oh, 0.7%, no big deal. That's in 1 month, seasonally adjusted. If you multiply that times 12 months, think about how much inflation you have. It's up over 8% annualized. So, the problem is big, and it's getting bigger, and inflation is not just high, it's accelerating.
Well, listen, when we come back from break, let's talk a bit about the potential consequences if we don't wrestle our spending habits to the ground. I think there's a lot more to discuss there and what the long-term possible effects can be, not only on inflation, but on the dollar, cost of living, all these things. When we come back from break, we're going to talk about the long-term effects. Welcome back to the Hill Update. Joining me on the show today is Pierre Poilievre. Pierre, we talked in the first segment about the government spending money out of control. Second segment, we talked about inflation, what it means in terms of people's real take-home pay. Let's talk about, should we continue? I mean, what concerns me is we've come through a $350 billion deficit. We're looking at a $1.5 trillion in total deficits and debt over the next couple of years. What happens if the government continues to spend at these unprecedented levels unchecked?
Debt crisis.
Explain. Talk to us about what that means. I mean, we're concerned about what that means to our dollar at the end of the day. So talk to us about what a debt crisis could mean to our country if we don't deal with this issue.
Well, don't ask me. Ask Reinhart and Rogoff, two Harvard professors who studied 800 years of debt crises. And by the way, they said before every debt crisis they studied, there were the same words spoken by the leaders. This time is different. Yes, we're showing all the symptoms of a debt crisis, but this time's different. There's a new technology. There's a wonderful new approach that is going to help us fight the immutable laws of mathematics. But what happens during a debt crisis, Dean? According to Reinhart and Rogoff, unemployment rises 7 percentage points. The debt rises 85% above where it starts in the crisis because the spending and the revenues go out of control. Unemployment, having risen 7%, then contributes to massive social problems. For example, the University of Calgary has shown that a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment is associated with a 2% increase in suicides. People lose their homes. House prices drop on average by 30%, meaning that for many people, their house is worth less than their mortgage. So they sell it at a loss, which means the banks can face crises, which they then pass, of course, on to taxpayers when they get bailed out. And people lose their homes, their jobs, and in the end, some lose their lives. That's what happens in a debt crisis. It is not just something that happens on an investment banker's spreadsheet. It is something that happens in your home. It is a mother and a father up at 2 or 3 in the morning around a kitchen table saying, what the hell are we going to do? We have no idea how to pay the bills. What are we going to do when we lose our home? That's what happens in debt crises. They are very inhumane. They are brutal, and they must be avoided at all costs. But we are on track right now. We do not change course to having one.
We see government overspending all around the world. Europe, the U.S., no exception. We see the U.S. dollar starting to crater under the the printing of money. Talk to us about I hear digital currency. I hear that from Europe. I hear the Feds talking about the U.S. I hear about it here in Canada. We got about just over a minute left, Pierre. Talk to us a bit about what that means in terms of, are we heading towards a digital currency when our fiat money means nothing at the end of the day?
Well, the only thing that central banks would do with the digital currency is convert the fiat money that they're already abusing into a digital account that people would have directly deposited at the central bank rather than through their charter bank or credit union. So that would effectively give more power to government over people's financial transactions. It would also raise a lot of questions about whether central banks and therefore the government can track people's purchases, whether they could use it to penalize certain unapproved activities and encourage others. This is a government, remember, Dean, that said it was going to punish organizations that are pro-life by banning them from getting summer students. Well, imagine if such a government then had a look into your bank account and every expenditure you made. Would you trust them to allow you to freely make your own decisions with your own money if they had that kind of surveillance authority? These are all questions that need to be answered by these central bankers who now want to increase their power by potentially introducing this digital currency concept.
Well, Pierre, thanks. That's all the time. I'd like to bring you back sometime to talk more about that digital currency. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Excellent. Great to be with you, Dean.
Well, it may seem like a great idea to continue to spend well beyond our means, but what we heard today is that government spending beyond our means always has consequences. So we need to consider that we need to live within our means, just like a lot of other families do. Dean Allison, I'm with the Hill Update, and thanks for joining us today.